Hey everyone, this is your professor Adam Dunstan, and the lecture for this week is language. Does it matter how we say what we say? Which might seem like a weird question. So to intro that, I want to talk a little bit about internet speak. So in your book, they talked about gamer speak, and I'm going to be talking about kind of a broader category of just in general internet slang and internet speak. And so your book used examples like lag, XP, noob, and so forth that get used sometimes in gaming circles. I found this handy dandy thing from the internet about internet speak abbreviations. Some of these seem really dated or I've never seen them before, but some of them definitely we still use all the time. BTW, BRB, IDK, stuff like that. And, I think no one can deny that within the last really 15 years, we have seen an explosion of new terminology, new acronyms within internet speech, and even stuff specific to specific domains of internet speak, right? Things specific to Facebook, things specific to games, things specific to texting. And I think that's incredibly significant, and I think most scholars think that that's incredibly significant. We've kind of never seen a language evolve so rapidly in real time. It's fascinating. It's rapid language shift. And I want you to think of a question, which is this a good thing for language? All these new internet words and terms? Is it a bad thing? Is it none of the above? It's neither? How you answer that question might have a lot to do with how you view language. Language is an interesting thing. On the one hand, it's sort of that thing that we all take for granted so much. It's sort of like that old saying, ask a fish how the water feels today, and he'll say, what's water? Right? Because to a fish swimming in water, the water is just what's around you. So we don't always take much note of language, and yet at the same time, what I hope to show in today's lecture is that language profoundly shapes human life in the sense that human life as cultural beings would be utterly impossible without language. I think that's obvious, but we'll talk about it. Number two, language also shapes our ideas in ways we often don't realize. And number three, language also shapes our social relationships. It sets up hierarchies, it breaks up hierarchies. It's really interesting stuff. Back to internet speak, whether you think it's a good or a bad thing that language is shifting may have a lot to do with sort of your own perspective on language. Some people are what we sometimes call prescriptivists in the sense that, we think of language as this really set thing and there's sort of good English and bad English or, correct Spanish or incorrect Spanish. By contrast, I would say a lot of anthropologists take the approach that languages in general aren't really good or bad. Most well-developed languages, I would say all well-developed languages, have the ability to convey complex information, so they do their job, so to speak, and sort of one's not better than another. We sometimes sort of judge certain accents or certain dialectical differences between English as more or less professional, but anthropologists and other social scientists typically argue that that's pretty much a subjective judgment, right? They equally do the job. Now, they may not equally do the job in different contexts, though, which is why you may still need to learn specific ways you communicate in a workplace environment versus to a friend, but that in and of itself is telling of how much information language connotes, even not just in the words we use, but in how we use them in terms of sending messages about ourselves and about other people. So language is a fascinating thing, and I hope to highlight some of that fascinating stuff about it today in this lecture. And you can probably tell already, I'm kind of a nerd about this stuff. I really like language. I consider myself a linguistic anthropologist. All right, so as I'm saying, kind of 3 points in this lecture. Number one, language is really why culture can even exist at all. Number two, language shapes and is shaped by our views of the world. And number three, language sets up hierarchies and power and identities, but it also disrupts them. All right, so first of all, the idea that language exists because of culture. Your book refers to this. It says that language is, quote, one of the most essential aspects of culture. So if you didn't do the reading, there you go. You read at least one sentence out of the textbook this week. But, I think that was a really good point, and I kind of want to riff off that for a minute, because it's really true. Culture, in the sense that we think of it, these shared ways of life that have allowed human beings to survive for thousands of years, have allowed human beings to thrive in environments as diverse as snowy Alaska and the tropical rainforest. That thing we call culture that makes human life even possible, that thing, culture, could not exist. We could not do what we do as human groups without culture. So let's talk about why. let's do a little activity. Well, actually, we can't do it because we're not in person. So I'll just tell you what the activity is and what I usually do when I'm teaching this class in person. This is Professor X from some of the more recent X-Men movies. If you don't know who the X-Men are, I don't know what to tell you. They're awesome. I'm a child of the 90s, though, so of course I think that. But, if I tell my students when I'm teaching this lecture, break into groups of 2, and then I tell the person on the right, think of something. Don't tell anybody what you're thinking of. And then I tell the person on the left, guess what the other person is thinking. And if they, they're occasionally right, sort of by statistical probability and other things. But usually they're wrong, right? Usually they are wrong. And that is because none of us are Professor X. So if you're familiar with Professor X from the X-Men movies, he has the ability to read what other people are thinking and also to communicate into their brain. But of course, that's not actually how human beings, barring perhaps supernatural things, generally speaking, that's not how human beings work. We can't transmit thoughts like that. Certainly you might know a friend really well and be able to read their facial communication, but it's still a facial communication. You're not actually inside their brain. And so, that's true of human beings. That's true of all of us. We have all these ideas locked up in our brain unless we can get them to other people. Because that's really what culture is. Culture is shared ideas. So long as an idea is just in your brain, it's not culture yet. But as soon as it starts getting out of your brain and into other people's brain, that's what makes it culture. And that's been true since the beginning of human history. We have good reason to believe that language was necessary for even the earliest of humans, I should say, early within modern Homo sapiens. So for several thousand years, there were certainly hominins pre-language. But for several thousand years, that it would have been really helpful and important for hunting strategies and later on for farming strategies, because the way that human beings hunt, very often requires people to work in teams. And that is true whether we're sort of doing long distance hunting, like we've talked about with the Juhwanzi in southern Africa, sort of, taking turns running an animal to exhaustion, or whether we're talking about Gwich'in people here in Alaska prior to colonialism setting up huge caribou fences that would sort of herd the caribou into a specific spot where you could shoot them with arrows or get them with traps. So for us to do things like that, collaborative hunting, collaborative farming, we had to be able to plan together. And for that to work, we had to be able to really fully communicate with each other. And certainly that we got better at that as our language got better. And so, again, language makes human culture as we currently understand it possible to a great degree. It's not that there was no culture going on with hominins before that, but it was as we've talked about before, the changes in culture were very, very slow. But then once humans get into where they can use language to transmit ideas, that is one of the reasons why suddenly changes in culture start to accelerate much more rapidly. We can share ideas, we can learn new things, and then transmit those to others. That's not to say that there's nothing in culture that doesn't, there's not parts of culture that don't require language, right? You can watch, so a big part of culture is this idea of proxemics that your book talks about, or sort of what we consider to be our personal space boundaries versus our boundaries with somebody we know versus somebody we don't know. Stuff like that, you don't necessarily need language to understand it. Little kids observe other people in their culture and they start to get a sense of how far away from somebody you're supposed to be when you talk, which varies by culture. So it's not that every part of culture is language-based, but a whole lot of it, a tremendous amount of it is language-based. It would not exist if we didn't have language, because we transmit ideas from one person to another. This person, is thinking of a tree. They turn that into a sound, tree, which isn't actually a tree. It's just a sound that we've decided says tree. And then this person hears it and thinks tree. And, same thing if we're doing signs instead of sign language. Concept in speaker's brain gets coded into a symbol and then gets encoded or decoded by the next person to where they can now in their brain understand the same idea. And these two people, through the magic of language, because I truly do think language is magical, these two people are able to share the same world for a moment. Maybe not entirely. Sometimes we mean different things by words. Just think about sort of when, two people say I love you early on in a romantic relationship and one person's thinking I love you like a buddy and one person's thinking I love you like a lover. That can be awkward. But for the most part, even though we do sometimes have some slippage in terms of what words mean to different people, for the most part, our ability to use language allows us to operate in shared ideascapes, shared worlds of ideas. And that is just incredibly powerful. I cannot say enough about the magic of language. So really, without language, we wouldn't have culture, not culture as we currently understand it. Some animals arguably have culture despite not having language, but really that's not even entirely true, because those animals that I'm thinking of that have sort of elements of culture, they have advanced communication systems. We wouldn't call it language, and we'll talk about why in a second, but we would say they have really advanced communication. So for example, whales. Whales, one could argue, have culture in the sense that different pods or groups of whales sometimes have different whale songs unique to their group. So one could argue that that's cultural and a form of communication. Same thing with like chimpanzees going on a hunting expedition together. So we're not going to argue that there's no culture in animals, but we're going to suggest that how we think of culture as humans really doesn't exist in non-human animals, and that's in large part because they lack language as we understand language. So what is language? I have here this. It says human language. It's Texas, which probably doesn't make any sense to you, which shows you how weird language is, because you're thinking of the state, unless you did the reading by Barford, where Barford talks about the fact that a few years ago in Norway, it became popular for people to use the word Texas to mean crazy, as in this party, it's so Texas, right? It's so crazy. I don't... Sorry, I had to do that in English because I don't speak any of the Nordic languages. Anyways, but to say it's Texas to mean, oh, something's crazy. And, you know, there's been different theories of where that came from, but it's kind of an interesting thing that this American word kind of made its way over to Europe and got into Norwegian folks' vocabulary. It shows you some interesting things about human language, because human language really is interesting. Human language really is crazy when we stack it up against non-human animal communication, because, you know, tons of animals can communicate, but human language is really different. It's really one of our most unique traits, along with things like bipedalism and, you know, opposable thumbs. I would say language, though, really sets us apart. Language, as defined in your book, is a symbolic system expressing meaning through sounds or gestures. And I want to especially focus on that, quote, symbolic system, because that's those two things, that it's a standardized system, that it's got a bunch of socially agreed upon meanings, and that it's symbolic, that it can stand for other things, makes it different from virtually all non-human communication, other than things like, you know, chimps that we've trained to speak sign language. Naturally occurring animal communication can be advanced for animals, but it's not a symbolic system in the sense that we're using that term. A way another textbook puts it that I no longer use it for this, they say a system of communication that uses symbols such as words, sounds, and gestures organized according to certain rules, right? So that's different than a lot of types of animal communication, and especially the fact that not only is it a system of rules, it's standardized to some degree, but it's also symbolic in nature. So I want to clarify what we mean by symbols. This is a painting, a rather famous painting, and it's a painting of a pipe, and then below it, it has the words, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe." My French is terrible, so apologies, but that says, this is not a pipe. And, you know, what that is getting at is the idea that the pipe is not a pipe, right? The picture, this is really just brown and black coloration on a canvas, and actually now for you, it's really just brown and black being transmitted through your LED screen on your computer. And so it's not a pipe, it's just there to look like a pipe and tell us to think of a pipe, but it's not really a pipe, it just represents a pipe. Furthermore, this painting kind of works on two levels, because the "Ceci n'est pas une pipe," this is not a pipe, those words, specifically the P-I-P-E, cursive letters down there, that's not a pipe, right? The letters P, I, P, and E are not a pipe. You cannot take those four letters to your mouth and then smoke tobacco from them. So it's not a pipe. So that's the idea of a symbol. A symbol is something that stands in for something else. So a lot of animals have the ability to convey the idea of, I am alarmed, I am scared, I want food, I found food, I want to mate, things like this. But human language is uniquely symbolic. It is not to say that there's no symbolism in other animal languages, but we have a far, far, far more advanced ability to use our communication to talk about things that are not those, to represent things that are not those things itself, right? To use words to talk about everything from the tree in front of me to the concept of reincarnation, right? We can use it to talk about something that happened 1,000 years ago, or to use it to talk about some such sort of abstract concepts as justice. So symbols are incredibly powerful in this regard, and they're also sort of packed with meaning, right? Think about, for example, the Star of David within Judaism, which many people have given many different meanings of sort of where different spiritual meanings of the Star of David, including, of course, David using that on his shield during battle, the famous biblical King David, but also the idea that the two triangles represent the union of God and humanity, or the combination of male and female, or that there's the 6 point and then the center representing the 7 days of creation, and thus the holy number 7. So much meaning can be packed into a symbol as well. So symbols are really powerful in their ability to refer to abstract, complex ideas, their ability to refer to things that may or may not be physically present, and their ability to also just pack a whole lot of meaning into one thing. So you can see right there that allows human beings to do things that other species cannot. And that works because symbols are socially defined. So there are certain things in human language that are the way they are because they're the thing, right? Like onomatopoeia. I growl like a cat because cats growl, and my growl is supposed to sound like a cat growling. And we call that sometimes iconic communication or indexical communication. But first of all, actually, how cats meow is not even agreed upon by all cultures, but more to the point, even though my imitation of a cat may actually sound like a cat, the word cat itself has nothing to do with the furry mammal, right? C, A, and T, those 3 letters together that we vocalize in English as cat, have nothing at all to do with a small little furry mammal with, cute ears. Other than we have decided that they have something to do with each other. Just like, as, within French, they've decided that chat does, and within China it would be Mao. So different cultures have decided differently about what we call this little furry thing. And if you can understand that basic concept, you understand actually a basic but kind of advanced linguistic concept, which is the distinction of signifier and signified, which is a classic idea in studies of language. And basically the signified is what we're talking about, and the signifier is what we use to talk about it. And, as a famous linguist once pointed out, the relationship between those is arbitrary. It's an empty signifier. It's socially defined. There's no reason that the letters C, A, and T had to be cat, but at some point in the long process by which our language came to exist, it was decided, or rather it came to be, that cat meant little furry mammal. By the way, that's one of the reasons why symbols, whether they're words or visual symbols or signs, why it's so important that symbols have to be understood in context. That there are symbols whose meaning wildly varies depending on where one is and where one is in a specific moment in time. If you ever go look at a lot of historic church buildings and historic buildings in the United States, you'll notice that quite a few have the pentagram on it. Nowadays, folks are used to thinking of the pentagram often in association with the religion of Wicca, or sometimes in a more pejorative way, people think of the pentagram in association with sort of evil magic kind of ideas. The pentagram, yes, is strongly affiliated with a variety of different things in sort of modern American consciousness, but in early American history was, it's a pretty basic geometric symbol, and like most basic geometric symbols, it pops up in a lot of different cultures, and it was often just sort of something that you threw onto buildings. Sort of, if anything, kind of a sacred symbol because it represents stars, and stars have a lot of biblical meanings. So, interesting how important context is. This is striking when you look at certain pieces of Navajo artwork where I do my research, where occasionally you'll have the sign that we call in English the swastika, and think of in relation, of course, as a hate symbol associated with the evils of Nazism. But because it's a pretty straightforward geometric symbol, it's popped up many different times throughout history in different cultures with really different meanings. In ancient India, it was used often as a good luck symbol. Within Navajo society, it was used to represent like a twirling log. So you have these symbols like crosses, like stars that pop up again and again, and the context really matters in terms of interpreting what they actually mean. So that's a little bit about sort of what makes human communication unique. That's a little bit about sort of what a language is. It's a system of symbols that, of course, changes over time. Let's talk a little bit more, though, about what makes human language unique. We can identify a few things. Your book kind of divides this into 3 things. I divided it into 4 things, but we're really saying the same thing. The book talks about sort of free use of symbols, and we've already talked that to death. I would also add to that, it's closely related, but the idea of displacement, which I'll define in a second. And then your book talks about infinite creativity of language, or what I'm calling openness, or we sometimes call it productivity or non-bounded language. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then your book says, of course, that language can deceive, which I don't have a lot to say about, but that is a true point, that human language is unique in its ability to deceive. We have very little indication that non-human animals do a lot of communication-based deceptions. It's not to say they don't deceive. Oh, they deceive all the time, right? Animals disguise as other things to scare off predators. But we're talking about like within an animal group, right? One chimp lying to another chimp or something. And that's very, very, very uncommon. There seems to be a little bit of evidence that maybe, there was a study where like a lemur one time in a laboratory intentionally deceived its cohort, but that seems to be really, 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 really uncommon among animals. Humans have this sort of dubious distinction that we're able to lie. But let's talk about some of these different features. Let's talk first about displacement. Displacement is actually arguably what allows for lying, but it also allows for a lot of other things like history, like religion, like philosophy, like ethics, because displacement refers to the fact that human language is able to refer to things which are not immediately present in the environment. We don't just say, hey, food. We don't just say, hey, mate. We don't just say, hey, danger. We can refer to stuff that's happening across the world. We can refer to stuff that's happening backwards or forward in time. We can refer to stuff that might not be happening at all. We can tell a story. And because of that, we can do things like pass on to each other stories about our history that inform who we are. So I've got here a picture of sort of Civil War reenactors, right? That kind of remembering histories, whether it's the history of a battle or a war, or whether it's the history of the founding of a country, or whether it's the history of the founding of a people, is possible because we can speak of that which is not present, and thus bring our ancestors into the present. This is primarily a human phenomenon. We tell histories. That makes us very, very unique. It also allows us to speak about abstract concepts like justice, right? Justice isn't a thing I can point to, but it's a thing that matters, and I can speak about it because our language offers us that deeply symbolic ability to speak about something that's not immediately present. Human language is also unique in its productivity, what your book calls its infinite creativity, or we sometimes call this openness or non-bounded language. Another book refers to this as the linguistic ability to use known words to invent new combinations. So that's, 4 different ways to speak about one concept, which is actually a good example of the concept, because the concept that I'm talking about here and that your book is talking about is that we can come up with lots of different new combinations. We can talk about things we've never talked about before. So it's a system, but it's an evolving system. I can make sentences that have never been made before in the human language. So as an example, I, Adam Dunstan, on this day, Friday, November 6th, am looking at my cell phone and it says 12:34, and I am sitting in Soldotna, Alaska. I think we can say with reasonable certainty that nobody has ever said that sentence before. So our languages were able to mix and match words, or sometimes even make up new words, and it makes it infinitely creative. We have just infinitely more variety to how we communicate than any other species on Earth. All right, well, that's a little bit about human languages. I want to take a quick break here.